Chapter 1. Beneath the smog veil I was born beneath a ceiling of smoke, not clouds, never clouds, but the unbroken veil of chemical haze that passed for a sky in the lower hive. My mother used to say that somewhere above the smog there was light, that the Emperor's sun still shone upon blessed soil. I remember laughing when I was old enough to understand how impossible that was. There is no sun here, only the industrial glow of furnace vents and the pallid shimmer of lumen strips that flicker like dying prayers. My first breath was poison. My first sound was the groaning of the hab block as the ventilation ducts coughed out their recycled fumes. The air tasted of metal and mold, heavy with the perfume of coolant leaks and rotting insulation. The walls sweated condensation that wasn't water, an oily residue that clung to skin and hair, marking us all as children of corrosion. They said I was born during an outage. Half the sector plunged into darkness for 3 standard days, and the habs shook as the generators rebooted. My father wasn't there. He'd been reassigned to vent maintenance 2 levels down and never came back. I never asked what happened. People disappeared in the hive the way sparks die in the void, briefly without ceremony. My earliest memory is of sound. The constant hum. It was everywhere. The droning of ducts, the thrum of power lines, the endless murmur of billions of lives stacked one atop another. The hive was a living thing, sick, swollen, and ancient beyond comprehension. It breathed through the vents and dreamed through the pipes. The noise was its heartbeat and we were its infection. We lived in Hab Block 19C sublevel Delta. The walls were the color of old blood, flaking rust and paint in equal measure. Our Hab cell was 3 meters by 2, shared by 5 of us. My mother, my 2 older siblings, my grandmother, and me. We slept in shifts rotated by the ration schedule. There were no windows, no clocks. Only the regulation sirens that howled twice per day, once for work commencement, once for curfew. The rest of the time we guessed the hour by the rhythm of the hive's breathing. Food was rationed by the Department of Civic Provisioning, though calling it food was a cruelty. Nutrient paste came in gray bricks marked with expiration sigils none of us could read. It tasted of chalk and despair. On better weeks my mother bartered for flavor packets, tiny ampules of synthetic spice stolen from upper-level mess halls. She'd stir them into the paste with trembling reverence, as if the Emperor himself might bless us with a hint of taste. Water was worse. You didn't drink it so much as filter it through your teeth. The pipes groaned and spat, and sometimes what came out was thick enough to chew. We learned early to let it settle, to scrape the sludge from the top before sipping. The old ones said it wasn't always like this, that the water once flowed clear from taps. I never believed them. Lies are just another kind of ration down here, passed from mouth to mouth until even the taste of truth goes stale. Every face I saw bore the same look. A hollow endurance, like machinery on the verge of failure, but too afraid to stop. The eyes of the people around me weren't windows but mirrors, reflecting the same tired dread I carried inside. Children didn't laugh here. Laughter was a waste of breath. You save that air for work, for prayer, for survival. Even as a child I understood the truth no one spoke aloud. Survival was not a right in the hive. It was an administrative error, a misfiled form that somehow hadn't yet been corrected. We were alive because someone somewhere hadn't noticed us. And the moment they did, we'd be processed, recycled into something more useful. Sometimes, when the ventilation ducts fell silent, I'd climb to the upper catwalk outside our block and stare into the depths. Below, the hive fell away into endless blackness. A vertical sea of habitation layers and industrial sectors, stacked like the vertebrae of a dead god. I used to imagine what lay at the very bottom, whether it ended in solid ground or if the hive just sank forever, down into molten rock and forgotten machinery. The air down there was thicker, denser, as if gravity itself had grown tired. The older ones whispered about the surface, but none of them had ever seen it. Some said the surface was a myth, a story told to keep us from despair. Others swore it was real but unreachable, a paradise buried under layers of our own excrement. The administratum's records listed millions of citizens, but we all knew that number was a lie. For every name written, 1,000 more were born undocumented, uncounted, unremembered. We were ghosts haunting a city that no longer knew it was dead. My grandmother kept an old data slate cracked and half dead. Its screen flickered when it charged, showing fragments of old imperial edicts. She would trace the lines of text with her fingers, whispering the words as though they were holy scripture. Serve, endure, produce. Those 3 commandments were etched into every surface, printed on every ration packet and stamped onto the minds of every child. Serve, endure, produce. That was all we were meant to do. Anything else was sedition. I remember the day I first saw an enforcer. I must have been 5 or 6. He walked the corridor with the sound of metal boots on metal floor, his rebreather hissing like a caged beast. His armor was black and unblemished, polished to a shine that looked obscene against our rusted world. I remember staring at his visor, seeing my reflection in it, a small, dirty face, wide-eyed and trembling. He paused to look at me, and for a heartbeat I thought he might speak. But he didn't. He just raised his shock maul and tapped it against the wall once, a warning. Then he walked on. That was the first time I understood fear. Not the fear of death, but the fear of being noticed. Every cycle, the overseers would visit the block for census recalibration. They came with servo skulls that floated on whining thrusters, their lenses blinking red as they scanned our faces. Each skull bore the sigil of the Department of Human Resources, skulls upon skulls, sanctified symbols of data collection. We lined up in the corridor, silent as condemned men. The skulls would hover before each of us, projecting a green beam across our features. If the beam turned red, you were removed from the line. No one ever returned from removal. Once the beam turned red for a girl named Lena. She lived 3 doors down, a quiet child who used to hum to herself at night. The servo skull let out a mechanical shriek, and the overseer dragged her away by the wrist. Her mother screamed until her throat tore. The next day her hab cell was sealed with a purity lock, and her name erased from the block's census records. It was as if she had never existed. The hive had corrected its error. I tried not to dream after that. Dreams were dangerous. They made you remember things, and remembering was a kind of rebellion. The only light in our lives came from the lumen shrines scattered through the corridors. Each shrine was a small alcove of flickering candles, crowned by a rusted image of the Emperor's skull. We were taught to stop and bow every time we passed one, to whisper the litany of gratitude. I am dust, yet he remembers me. I never believed it. But I said it anyway. You said the words because silence drew attention, and attention drew pain. Once I saw a man refuse to kneel. He just walked past the shrine, head down, eyes dead. The hab guards caught him 2 corridors later and dragged him back. They forced him to his knees and made him kiss the shrine until his lips bled. Then they made him thank the Emperor for the lesson. I watched from behind a grate, trembling, and learned that faith wasn't about belief. It was about compliance. The hive taught me other lessons too. How to read the color of the smoke rising from the vents. Black meant machinery failure, green meant chemical spill, red meant someone had died where they shouldn't have. How to listen for the shift in air pressure before a bulkhead sealed. How to hold your breath when the recycling ducts backflushed, or the stench would burn the inside of your lungs. Children didn't play. We scavenged. We learned to take apart broken machines and barter the parts for scraps. Sometimes when the vents went quiet and the upper levels dimmed, I'd sneak into the maintenance shafts to watch the recycler servitors work. They were terrifying things. Half man, half machine, their faces stretched into masks of pale, waxy flesh. They sorted the refuse with slow, deliberate motions, never stopping, never speaking. I used to wonder if they still remembered who they were before the augmetics took them. Once I saw one of them hesitate, just for a moment. Its clawed hand hovered over a heap of scrap, trembling. Then it turned its head toward me, and I swear its single red eye focused just for an instant. A sound escaped its throat, a strangled, wet whisper like a sigh. I ran then, crawled back through the ducts until my skin bled from scraping metal. I never went back. I think that was the moment I stopped believing I was alive in the way life was meant to be. There was no childhood. Not really. Only the slow preparation for work. From the moment you could walk, you were trained to endure, to carry, to clean, to obey. The administratum taught us that suffering was a virtue, that endurance was holy. We recited it every day before meal rations. Pain is proof of purpose. I repeated it until I could no longer tell if it was truth or just noise in my skull. Sometimes, the vents would hum in a certain way, a deep, rhythmic drone that seemed almost like a chant. My mother said that was the hive praying. She told me to close my eyes and listen, to let the sound fill me. But when I did, I didn't hear prayer. I heard machinery. I heard a heartbeat that wasn't human. As I grew older, I began to understand that the hive didn't belong to us. We belonged to it. Every wall, every pipe, every flickering lumen, it all existed to keep the machine running. The people were just another moving part, replaceable and disposable. The administratum didn't need individuals. It needed numbers. And the only thing more terrifying than being counted was being forgotten. I used to dream of escape, though I didn't know where to escape to. There were rumors of levels where the air was clean, where the ceilings were so high you could see light that wasn't artificial. But even the rumors felt dangerous. The last boy I heard speaking of escape disappeared the next day. The overseer said he'd been reassigned to reclamation. We all knew what that meant. I learned to keep my head down, to move when told, to pray when expected. To speak only when silence drew suspicion. That was how you survived. Now, when I think back to those early days, I realize I was never really born, not in the way the upper classes might use the word. I was assembled like everything else in the hive. A product of smoke, metal, and administrative indifference. A child stamped with a serial number before I even had a name. If there was ever light above the smog, I never saw it. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still feel its warmth in the stories my mother told. A phantom heat that burns brighter for never having been real. And so I lived, beneath the smog veil, beneath the weight of 1 billion lives stacked atop mine, beneath the illusion that we were part of something divine. All I ever knew was rust and hunger, and the slow grind of existence measured in breath and bureaucracy. And that was enough, for now. Do you want me to continue to Chapter 2, The Factory of Endless Hours? You said also yes. Warhammer 40k outline expansion said excellent. Here's Chapter 2, The Factory of Endless Hours, expanded into full first-person grimdark narration, 2,000 words. Chapter 2, The Factory of Endless Hours. I was 12 when the administratum decided I had outlived my education. Education, of course, was a generous word. It meant memorizing the proper litanies of productivity and the sequence of servitor hierarchy. It meant learning how to count bolts, how to recite serial numbers, and how to obey without question. The final lesson was a sermon projected across the block in flickering vox distortion. A child is an unprocessed worker. Processing is mercy. The next day the servo skulls came. Their arrival was always heralded by that faint electrical whine, like mosquitoes made of metal. They floated through the corridors in formation, draped in incense smoke, each one bearing a parchment strip sealed with red wax. The overseers followed behind, faces hidden by respirator masks, their robes marked with the sigil of the manufactorum census. My mother wept quietly as they read out names. When they spoke mine, she didn't try to stop them. She just kissed the side of my head and whispered, "Remember to keep your eyes down. Never be the first to speak." They branded my forearm with an identity rune, a neat circular mark that burned for hours and left my skin smelling like cooked meat. Then they gave me my new designation, Worker Unit 6731A. My name was struck from the census. I was no longer her child. I was now the property of the Department of Labor Reclamation. The manufactorum was a continent of metal within the hive, a labyrinth of pipes, vents, and foundries that stretched farther than sight. We were marched in ranks of 50, barefoot on the grating floors that hummed with static. Every sound echoed, a mechanical symphony of grinding gears, hissing steam, and the ceaseless clang of production. The air was so thick with particulate that the lumen strips above glowed like dying stars through perpetual dusk. They told us we were making lasgun casings. We would never see the weapons, never touch them. Our task was a single action repeated infinitely. Feed, seal, stamp, eject. Every worker performed one gesture over and over, as if the hive had reduced humanity to a single twitch of motion. I remember my first day at the station. The metal was cold beneath my palms, slick with machine oil. The servitor beside me moved with precise insect-like motions, its flesh gray and sagging, the whir of augmetic limbs filling the gaps where human breath should have been. A black cable pierced the back of its skull, connecting it to the data line that snaked overhead. Every few minutes, a spark of static would jolt through the line and make its body convulse. I learned quickly not to flinch. Our overseer was a gaunt man encased in half-rusted augmetics, his voice amplified through a vox grill that distorted it into a grating hymn. He carried a shock baton shaped like a holy relic and recited productivity prayers between strikes. Work is worship. Waste is heresy. The emperor endures, and so shall your labor. We repeated these words until they became part of the noise. another clanging gear in the endless machine. Hours had no meaning there. There was only the rhythm of the presses, the hiss of the forges, and the brief flicker of lumen lights that signaled shift rotation. Time was measured in blisters and blood. They chained us to our stations literally, a loop of steel at the ankle to remind us that the factory did not trust its children. The chain allowed just enough movement to reach the feed trays and the waste chute. I learned that if you moved too quickly, the chain caught and tore the skin. Many bore scars around their ankles like dark halos. The smell was inescapable. Hot oil, ozone, sweat, and the faint rot of flesh that had gone too long without washing. We were not permitted water breaks. Instead, nutrient slurry was pumped through wall dispensers once every few hours. It tasted like burnt metal and despair, but it kept us upright. The servo skulls hovered constantly above us, recording every motion, every hesitation. If you slowed your rhythm, a red light blinked overhead. Too many red lights, and the overseer came with his baton. The sound of it striking flesh was the true hymn of the manufactorum. Once a boy beside me collapsed. His hands simply stopped moving. Maybe he was dead. Maybe he'd fallen asleep standing up. It didn't matter. The overseer didn't stop the line. He just nodded to a servitor, which unhooked the chain from the boy's ankle and dragged him away. The machine didn't pause. Another child was brought in before the next rotation. There was no mourning, only adjustment. We were told that the Emperor watched us from every lumen strip, that he blessed our sweat and forgave our weakness only if we turned it into labor. The overseers made us chant the litany of repetition every sixth rotation. The hand that falters offends. The hand that bleeds redeems. The hand that endures serves the throne. I began to dream of hands, broken ones, blistered and blackened, clawing at the machine that devoured them. I would wake to the clang of the presses and realize I had been dreaming while standing upright, my arms still moving in rhythm. That was when I understood that I was no longer entirely human. The machinery sang louder than prayer. Its voice was iron and steam. It echoed in my skull long after I was released from my shift. Even in the supposed rest period, my muscles twitched to the cadence of the factory's pulse. We slept in barracks stacked 8 bunks high, shoulder to shoulder, each breathing in the same recycled air. There were no windows, no silence, only the ever-present vibration of production through the walls. Sometimes the lights would flicker and reveal the writing scratched into the metal beside the bunks. He sees all. Keep moving. Don't think. Some of the etchings were written in dried blood. Once, during a power surge, the entire manufactorum shuddered. The lights died for 3 heartbeats. In that darkness I heard something deeper than machinery. A groan that seemed to come from the bones of the hive itself, like the city was alive and suffering. When the lights came back, one of the servo skulls had fallen. Its lenses shattered. It lay twitching on the floor, still whispering data fragments. Productivity deviation. Heresy, heresy. They burned it while we watched. Weeks bled into each other. Months, maybe. I stopped counting rotations because counting implied an end. The factory was eternity. Every now and then, we were visited by a tech priest. They came shrouded in red robes, their faces hidden behind respirators that hissed incense into the air. Their metal limbs clicked as they moved, their voices layered with vox distortion. They spoke not to us but to the machines, blessing the cogs with unguents and chanting binary hymns. When one of the machines jammed, they performed what they called the rite of realignment. It looked like repair to us, but they treated it like exorcism. Once the priest opened a console and found a human finger caught in the gears. He didn't flinch. He just removed it, anointed the spot with oil, and intoned, "The flesh is weak. The mechanism endures." That phrase haunted me for years. One night, a girl across from me started laughing. A hysterical, broken sound. The overseer hit her once, twice, but she kept laughing. Finally, he took out a small injector from his belt and plunged it into her neck. She went still immediately, her eyes rolling back. 2 servitors came and carried her away. The overseer told us she had been retired for inefficiency. I never saw her again. But sometimes when the vents howled, I thought I could hear her laughter echoing through the pipes. The worst part wasn't the pain or the hunger. It was the sameness. The monotony pressed down heavier than the smog. Each movement, each breath was identical to the last. Days didn't end. They dissolved into each other until you couldn't tell if you were living or just remembering. Chapter 3. The Ration Riots. The decree arrived as a cough in the vents. It started with a dry rattle, A fluttering bronchial sound from deep in the ducts, like the hive itself clearing its throat to announce a liturgy no one wanted to hear. Then the vox grills crackled open along the corridor, their cones furred with centuries of dust, and a voice poured through them, stiff, nasal, and married to static. Attention citizens of sub-level Delta. By order of the Department of Civic Provisioning effective this cycle, potable allotments are reduced by 37%. Deviations from Q discipline are punishable by fines, lash, or reclamation. Repeat, potable allotments are reduced. Praise be to the Golden Throne. The words were bland as chalk. They landed like stones. In the manufactorum, reductions meant blisters that never healed and lungs that learned a new vocabulary for pain. In the hab blocks, they meant something worse, the animal arithmetic of thirst. There are needs that make you negotiate with your soul, and water is one of them. You think you'll be reasonable, that you'll swallow pride and bile and make do. But thirst is not a negotiator. It is an empire of salt, and it knows only conquest. The lumen strips were already dim from the smog day. The air was heavy, a wet furnace that pressed the taste of metal deeper into the gums. The ration taps along our corridor, 4 spigots set into the wall like teeth in a jaw. Each bore its purity sigil and its little brass slot for chits. We formed the usual Q, back straight, eyes forward, breath held just so. Q discipline was survival. If you mastered that posture, you could pretend to be a compliant organ, some respectable tissue in the hive's cancerous body. But the chits changed. The machine that ate them began to spit them back. Insufficient credit. Insufficient merit. Insufficient faith. People stared at the returned slips as if the brass had insulted them personally. A few tried feeding the same chit again, slower, as though patience were a sacrament the slot would recognize. When the tap grudgingly gave water, it was thinner. A tired dribble that took its time entering the world, as if even the liquid were exhausted by our expectations. By the 3rd cycle after the decree, the line had doubled. By the 4th, it broke. I knew things were turning when I saw a man lean his forehead to the wall and speak to the metal. His lips moved in a whisper I couldn't catch. The rust did not answer. Behind him, 2 sisters, girls I knew by the way they cinched their sleeves back with wire to keep them out of the gears, argued with a woman whose hair had been shaved down to a velvet pelt. A work infraction penance. The argument wasn't words so much as breath. Little bursts of air shaped around terms like my turn and your god and quota. Their faces were dry as clay. One sister's lower lip had split. Blood clung there, refusing to look like anything but the water it wasn't. Q discipline, the hab warden shouted, baton held like a prayer stick. Q discipline or fines? No one moved. Fines were for days with water. The tap coughed and stopped. The brass slot lit red. There are sounds that announce history, trumpets and bells and the crack of banners in clean air. We didn't have those sounds. We had the sound of a bowl hitting the floor. A boy, small, ash blonde, the bones of his face ironed outward by hunger, had stumbled. His bowl rolled, clattering until it found a seam in the floor and settled with a tin sigh. The water inside it rocked once, twice, made one last attempt at being a mirror, then leapt out onto the grate and vanished between the teeth of the world. He made a sound I still hear. Not sorrow, not rage. Something drier. A vocabulary made of sand. His mother tried to shush him, but shushing is for problems solved by softness. She reached for the tap, and the man with his forehead against the wall slapped her hand away with open palm, then looked surprised at himself, as if he had meant to do something else, something civilized. The sisters lunged. The warden raised the baton. Words boiled out of mouths and dissolved into steam. It was heat. It was pressure. It was the hive's lungs failing to finish a breath. Then somebody screamed, "Leak!" 3 doors down, Unit 19C's corridor elbow where the pipe bent under a shrine. A weak vein of water had burst through a blistered seam. A line as delicate as a copied saint's tear traced down the wall and beaded on the floor. We saw it at the same time, a dozen sets of eyes widening. The air itself tightened. People moved without permission from their minds. It wasn't a mob yet. It was a confession that blood would be cheaper than chits. The warden shouted again, "But there are decrees and there are needs, and only one of them makes your bones ache." The boy with the empty bowl ran first. His mother followed. A pair of old men, a matched set of lumbar spines bent like hooks, shuffled faster than I'd believed possible. The sisters shrieked and pushed. All those bodies tried to fit through the elbow's mouth at once, and the corridor became a windpipe clogged by a meal too big to swallow. I didn't run. Not at first. I stood with my ration chit useless in my palm and tasted the air. My tongue had become a piece of leather I carried in my mouth. The part of my brain that had learned cue discipline told me I was behaving like a criminal just by thinking about moving. The rest of me was already walking. My legs went as if someone else had deputized them. At the elbow, the leak became a miracle and then a crime. Hands made cups and caught a little. Lips pressed to metal. Tongues hunted the contour of the seam as if the pipe were a lover that needed reassurance. Someone produced a rag, pressed it to the wall and wrung out drops into a lid. Someone else tried to shoulder their way closer by producing a knife. It wasn't a notable knife, just a piece of workday scrap ground to stubbornness. But at the sight of it, the pressure changed. We ceased to be citizens and became mouths. The knife came down. Not into the pipe, no one was that blasphemous yet. Into an arm, a meaty, unsaintly arm that belonged to a man named Rusk. He bit the attacker's ear. The attacker squealed. The sisters fell to the floor with their bowl between them, both clawing at it like cats pretending to be pious. The boy's mother began to scream all the syllables of his name, making it too large to be useful. The warden's baton landed on someone's spine, then someone else's skull. But the baton was a stick and thirst was a planet, and a stick can only orbit a planet for so long before gravity names it debris. My hands found the wall. The leak was a cold finger brushing my knuckles. I closed my eyes and tried to calculate how many droplets made a drink. There is an exact number. There must be. Everything here has a number. But numbers are arithmetic and thirst a theology. The pipe god had no interest in my sums. When I opened my eyes, the corridor was shrieking in two languages, the mammal one, all teeth and fury, and the administrative one, full of warning tones and sanctioned authority. The first enforcer stepped into view at the far end, black armor swallowing the lumen light visor a blank mercy. He was a column of rubber and alloy in law. His shock maul hummed to life in his hand, little arcs of saintly blue leaping like insects. By order of civic peace, his vox barked, voice turned metal by the mask. Disperse and prepare for reprocessing. No one dispersed. We had already been processed into the shape of need. The second enforcer arrived, then the third, like punctuation marks in a sentence ending in prayer and blood. They formed a line, shields forward. Each shield stamped with the emblem of order, a skull that had outlived the faces of a billion. Behind them drifted a pair of servo skulls, lenses clicking as they recorded our misdeeds for storage in a vault deeper than our dead. The first maul fell on the back of a head and turned skull to liturgy. The second caromed off a shoulder and clarified a man's intentions forever. There's a smell shock makes, a sweetened pork stink that rises from flesh and curls up into your sinuses like stale incense. I tasted it and thought absurdly of the manufacturum slurry on its saltier days. Someone bit my wrist and left half their teeth in my skin. A shield shoved me hard enough to make my lungs consider unemployment. The leak still wept. Water was a witness to its own trial. I saw the boy again. Ash blonde, bowl recovered, hope-raging idiot fire in his chest. He got close enough to wet the rim. He lifted it with both hands, ready to drink with all the reverence of a convert. An enforcer's boot put him down. Not a kick, nothing so personal. Just a weight placed where bone met floor. The bowl skated away. The boy made that dry sand sound again. The boot stayed. The enforcer's visor turned fractionally toward the leak, assessing, calibrating, deciding which sin was most easily redeemed by pain. My throat made a sound without my permission. It might have been my name. It might have been stop. You don't know what you're pleading for under a boot. You only know the language boots understand contact. I moved. Not toward the enforcer. That would have been treason against anatomy. But toward the boy, to pull his arm out before the boot made his elbow a hinge in a new direction. My fingers met his, soapstone dry and very small. The boot shifted, found my hand, made a point of democracy. It pressed down. I saw black around the edges of my vision, then little silver spokes. Pain is a map. It shows you the fastest way to the truth. The truth was simple. The Emperor's mercy is heavy. It comes with tread. It leaves a mark like a stamped seal on the parchment of your skin. Compliance, the enforcer said, voice fed through voxgrit, is survival. The mauls kept writing their blue cursive along shoulders and ribs. The shields shepherded us as if we were Chapter 4. The faith of the desperate. They said faith was mandatory. We did not pray because we believed. We prayed because there was a quota for that too. Every second shift cycle, the klaxons would wail 3 times, a long metallic shriek echoing through the dripping corridors, and we knew it was time for the sermon. We shuffled from our dormitories in assembly lines, our backs still bent from labor, our fingers black with machine grease, our faces filmed in the gray ash that never quite left the air. The corridor stank of oil and stale incense, the holy reek of sanctified industry. I remember the sound of boots scuffing metal floors, the soft coughs of those who hadn't yet learned to swallow their breath to hide their weakness. Above it all, the endless hum of the hive, a mechanical heartbeat that no silence could ever smother. We gathered in the Hall of Devotion. That was its official designation, stamped in faded red letters on the archway, though we called it the cage. It had no windows, only tiers of flickering lumen strips that buzzed like insects, and an altar constructed from scrap plating and rebar. Behind the altar loomed a massive cog and skull mural painted directly onto the corroded wall, its colors long bled into rust. There was no gold, no stained glass, only steel, smoke, and the weary eyes of the congregation. The preacher would arrive escorted by 2 enforcers. His robes were once white, now the color of ashes, and his vox grill rasped with static as he spoke. His voice came amplified and distorted, a chorus of metallic echoes that filled the chamber and drilled into our skulls. Brothers and sisters of labor, he would begin. Your toil is your faith, your suffering your hymn. Every cut upon your flesh is an offering. Every breath drawn in pain is sanctified by his will. We stood, heads bowed, hands clasped before us in the approved posture. Some murmured the words. Others simply mouthed the movements, lips trembling, eyes vacant. The enforcers watched from the shadows, their shotguns resting across their armored chests. No one dared stay silent for long. I tried to remember when I had last prayed out of belief, not obligation. It must have been years ago, perhaps during the famine, when the rationing announcements had told us to trust in the Emperor's plan. I whispered those same words now out of habit, though I no longer knew what they meant. The Emperor protects, that was what they told us. Yet every day I watched workers fall into the conveyor belts, crushed by the weight of their own fatigue, and no divine hand reached out to save them. Perhaps he protected the idea of us, not the flesh. The preacher spoke of sin, our endless capacity for it. Sin in thought, sin in hunger, sin in despair. He said that doubt itself was the seed of heresy and that the only cure was sacrifice, and the desperate believed him. It began with the prayers spoken louder, then with cries, then with the cutting. I remember the first time I saw it. A woman, skin drawn taut over her bones, took a shard of broken plasteel from the floor and pressed it into her palm as she whispered the catechism of contrition. She sliced the flesh cleanly, drawing a shaking Aquila in blood, her eyes glazed with ecstasy and fever. Pain is purity, she said, smiling through her tears. Pain is the Emperor's language. Soon others followed. I saw men carving the sigil into their forearms, their faces pale, their blood dripping onto the deck plates. They said the pain helped them feel real again. In the endless grind of labor and order, pain was the only thing that still belonged to them. The preacher didn't forbid it. He called it the zeal of the sanctified. I did not cut. I only watched. I wondered if the Emperor could hear us through the endless hum of the hive's engines, if he could distinguish our whispered prayers from the mechanical drone that filled his empire. I doubted it. If he truly saw us, he would have wept. Or perhaps he had wept long ago, and what remained now was a machine that ran on habit and memory, grinding its people into a liturgy of dust. Once, during the sermon, the preacher asked for confession. He said we were to cleanse our souls of doubt before it festered. A man beside me, a machinist named Harl, raised his hand and stepped forward. He confessed that he had questioned the quotas. He said he had wondered if the administratum had miscounted, if the endless shortages were the result of error rather than divine will. The preacher nodded gravely. He said that doubt was a sickness and that the cure must be public. The enforcers dragged Harl away before the final benediction. The next day his workstation was empty, but the smell of burnt hair and oil lingered in the corridor outside the chapel. The preacher did not mention him again. Faith, we learned, was measurable. Faith had consequences. The sermons grew longer as the shortages worsened. The preacher's voice cracked with desperation. his rhetoric swelling like an infected wound. He spoke of apocalypse, of judgment, of a coming purification that would scour the unfaithful from the hive. He said that the Emperor's gaze was upon us even now, watching our every motion through the lenses of the surveillance cherubs that floated along the ceilings, their wings beating sluggishly under layers of soot. Sometimes one of the cherubs would falter, crash to the ground, and twitch like a dying insect. The enforcers would drag it away and another would take its place. We took that as a sign. We told ourselves it meant the Emperor was still watching, even if only through broken eyes. Nights were the worst. When the machines went quiet for maintenance and the lumen strips dimmed, the sermons replayed through the public vox, recorded exhortations to vigilance and obedience. The preacher's distorted voice would whisper through the vents, his words merging with the sounds of the air recyclers. Sometimes I would wake from half-sleep to hear him say, "Your suffering is the proof of his love. To be forgotten is to be blessed, for he forgets only those who have no use." I would lay there, staring at the flickering ceiling, and wonder if that meant we were all holy by now. One cycle, I was assigned to scrub the lower decks beneath the chapel. That was where they stored the incense and purgation oils, thick tar-black stuff that burned with a stench like scorched bones. I found the preacher there, kneeling before a cracked mirror, his mask removed. His face was not what I expected. Pale, almost translucent, veins mapped across his skull like blue filigree. His eyes were sunken, his lips split from too much speech. He was whispering to himself, though no one else was there. "Forgive me, for I no longer hear you," he said. I backed away before he saw me, but his words clung to me like the stink of the oil. Even he, the mouthpiece of the machine god's will, was deaf to the Emperor's silence. Perhaps faith was a chain we all wore, each link forged by fear. After that, I began to see cracks everywhere. The congregation no longer recited in unison. The rhythm faltered. People stopped bringing offerings of scrap or rations to the altar. The preacher's sermons grew more frantic, his eyes bloodshot, his voice shaking as he spoke of heretics among us. He said the Emperor demanded proof of loyalty in deeds, not words. The enforcers began to patrol the dormitories after curfew. Anyone found asleep without the devotional seal etched on their brow was taken away. They called it nightly cleansing. The faithless disappeared one by one. Still we gathered, because it was forbidden not to. Because even the absence of belief had to be performed. I mouthed the prayers as always. My lips cracked, bled. The words came out as dust. There was a child once, a boy no more than 10, who sat near the back of the chapel during the sermons. He was the son of a pipe worker who had died in a pressure breach. The boy would mimic the gestures of the adults, tracing the aquila across his chest with small trembling fingers. During one sermon, the preacher noticed him and called him forward. The boy approached the altar, eyes wide with awe and fear. The preacher asked him if he loved the Emperor. The boy nodded. The preacher smiled, then handed him a candle and told him to hold it as a symbol of devotion. The wax melted quickly, running over his hands. The boy tried to hide his pain, but his lips quivered and a soft whimper escaped. The preacher placed his hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "Pain purifies." When the candle was gone, the boy's palms were blistered, his tears glistening in the candlelight. We all clapped and shouted Ave Imperator, because not doing so would have been a crime. That night I heard the boy's mother weeping in the dormitory, her sobs muffled beneath her blanket. No one comforted her. Compassion was subversive now. I sometimes wonder what the Emperor would have thought if he could see what his faith had become. An engine of obedience, fueled by fear and misery. But such thoughts are heresy, and heresy has no mouth in the hive, only silence. As the cycles passed, the sermons became less about salvation and more about endurance. "You were not born to be saved," the preacher said one day, his voice hoarse and shaking. "You were born to serve until the end of your usefulness." There was no amends, no chance, just the sound of the hive itself, ventilation, machinery, the heartbeat of a God that had long since forgotten how to love. And yet, for all my doubt, I still whispered the words, not because I believed in him, but because I feared the silence that would follow if I stopped. The silence of being erased, of ceasing to exist in the ledgers of this vast, indifferent machine. Perhaps that is faith, in its purest form, the refusal to stop pretending. In the cycles that followed, the congregation dwindled. Disease spread through the lower hab blocks, a fever that turned the skin gray and brittle. The Preacher Collie. Chapter 5. The Uprising. Below it began with whispers. Whispers that slithered through the ventilation shafts, down the corridors, between the teeth of the machines. Whispers that smelled of oil, sweat, and quiet defiance. They said the foremen were dead. They said the quotas would not be met this cycle, and that the overseer's ledger had been torn from his hands and burned. They said someone, somewhere, had struck an enforcer and lived. We had heard such rumors before, of course. The hive fed on them, small bursts of madness that flared and vanished like sparks in the endless dark. But this time it lingered. There was a tone beneath the whispers, a rhythm that felt dangerous, alive. Even the hum of the machines seemed to falter, as if the hive itself were holding its breath. It started, they said, in the sludge vats. Those were the lowest manufactorums of all, the pits where waste was filtered, broken down, and repurposed into nutrient paste for the upper levels. The workers there were barely human anymore, skin bleached gray by chemical fog, eyes like pearls clouded by corrosion. When a foreman was found face down in the waste tanks, his lungs filled with his own poison, the authorities called it an accident. But everyone knew otherwise. His hands had been bound. The sign of the Aquila had been carved into his forehead, not as devotion, but as mockery, the mark of false faith. The enforcers came within the hour. They sealed the vats and dragged out 50 workers at random. No trial, no record, just fire. We watched from the catwalks as they turned flamers upon the line, the orange light flickering across the wet metal walls, the screams echoing through the ducts. The smell was unforgettable. Burning flesh mingled with the sweet chemical stench of the sludge, a perfume of industrial sin. The enforcers recited the edict of purification as they burned them. Let the unclean be rendered into fuel. When it was done, they left the corpses to smolder in the runoff channels. The next day the quotas were raised, and that was when it truly began. The first signs were subtle. A machine that jammed mysteriously every shift cycle, Vox lines that crackled with static, tools that vanished and reappeared in the wrong hands. But soon, sabotage became open defiance. A worker refused to kneel during the daily benediction. Another spat upon the symbol of the cog skull. The enforcers dragged them away, but others stepped forward. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in the eyes of authority. It spread like rot. The faith that had been beaten into us began to fester, to invert itself. What was once obedience became rage. I remember the night it reached our level. I was on cleaning duty, scrubbing the conduits near the dormitory gates, when the klaxons wailed, not the sermon's call but the alarm of revolt. The Vox speakers erupted with panicked commands. Maintain order, report disobedience, all gatherings are prohibited. Then came the gunfire. It echoed through the corridors like thunder. The lights flickered. Somewhere above, a ventilation duct exploded, raining rust and dust. I ran toward the sound, though I did not know why. Curiosity, perhaps, or the foolish urge to see rebellion with my own eyes before it was erased. The hab block was chaos. Smoke, blood, the shriek of last fire, the roar of voices shouting prayers and curses. The workers had armed themselves with tools, wrenches, saws, pipes sharpened to spears. Against the enforcer's armor it was nothing, but still they fought. I saw a man leap onto an enforcer's back, clawing at his visor until the shotgun blew him apart. Another woman threw a canister of solvent into the crowd, igniting half the corridor in a sheet of blue flame. She screamed, "For the Emperor," as she burned, though none of us knew whether she meant it as faith or defiance. In the confusion, the preacher's tapes began to play through the Vox, his voice droning the same hollow sermon from before. Your suffering is proof of his love. The sound mixed with the screams and gunfire until it was impossible to tell where the devotion ended and the rebellion began. The enforcers fought hard, but the hive was vast and layered. For every worker that fell, 2 more emerged from the ducts below. I saw them pour through the maintenance shafts like ants, faces blackened with soot, eyes shining with feverish light. They were not soldiers. They were hunger made flesh. And yet, despite the blood and smoke, I felt something strange stirring in me, something I had not felt since childhood. Hope, a small, fragile thing, a poison blooming in the dark. For the first time I thought, maybe we are not forgotten. Maybe the Emperor truly does see us now. Even as I thought it, I knew it was a lie. But lies can be warm when the world is cold. The enforcers began sealing hab blocks one by one. Massive bulkheads descended from the ceilings, trapping whole sections of the hive. The sound was monstrous, metal slamming against metal, followed by silence. Those trapped inside were marked non-compliant. I remember the smell that followed days later when the vents reopened. Burnt ozone, melted plastic, charred bone. It clung to the walls like memory. We called it the cleansing by omission. The administratum didn't even record the losses. They simply erased the block numbers from the ledgers. To them, those lives had never existed. Still, the rebellion continued below. The deeper manufactorums fell into chaos. Power flickered, production stopped, and the upper levels began to starve. The arbits had not yet arrived. The enforcers were stretched too thin. The hive became a living corpse, its arteries clogged with smoke and riot. I joined them in the end. Not out of courage, but because there was nowhere else to go. My dormitory had been sealed, my ID slate revoked. The machine no longer acknowledged me, and without the machine, a person was nothing. So I took a wrench, wrapped my face in a rag to block the ash, and followed the others into the lower tunnels. We met in the dark beneath the purification vats. Dozens of us, maybe hundreds. Faces I recognized from the lines, though their eyes were different now. Wild, bright, alive. Someone had scrawled words across the walls in red slurry. The Emperor forgot. We remember. They said we would march to the administratum hub, demand food, air, mercy. Some said we would burn it all down. The leaders argued in whispers, but it didn't matter. The hive didn't need plans. It needed pressure to break. When dawn cycle came, we moved. The corridors were a storm of bodies, a flood of rags and rage. We carried whatever weapons we could. I remember the sound most vividly, not the screams or the gunfire, but the thud of boots on metal, thousands of footsteps in unison. For a brief, impossible moment, it felt like we were more than expendable parts. We were a force, we were real. Then the enforcers opened fire. Las bolts sliced through the dark. Men and women fell, smoking holes where their chests had been. Someone beside me shouted, "Hold the line," as if that meant anything here. I swung my wrench at a visor, felt the jarring crunch as it connected. The enforcer fell, blood spilling black through the cracks of his mask. I looked down at my hands, trembling, slick with his blood, and realized I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Around me, the uprising began to crumble. Without weapons, without leaders, we were only meat against armor. The enforcers herded us back with shock batons and fire. The corridors filled with smoke, thick as wool. I stumbled over bodies, tripped on a severed arm, still clutching a tool. Somewhere, the preacher's voice returned over the vox, distorted into gibberish. Repent, purity, burn. When the fire came, it came all at once. Promethium sprayed across the crowd, a rain of holy flame. The screams became a single sound, high, continuous, almost mechanical. I saw a woman lift her burning child toward the ceiling, shouting a prayer that was lost in the roar. Then she was gone, and the light consumed everything. I don't remember how I escaped. I remember running, through corridors black with soot, past the half-melted icons of the Emperor, through vents that reeked of blood and rust. I ran until I found myself alone in a maintenance tunnel, the walls trembling with distant gunfire. My lungs burned, my ears rang, my hands shook with what might have been laughter or hysteria. We had risen, and we had fallen, all within the span of a single cycle. In the silence that followed, I sat in the dark and listened to the hum of the hive. the same endless vibration that had always been there. It was unchanged, indifferent. The rebellion had not even left a scar. I knew, even then, that by the next cycle the machines would run again, the quotas would return, and the sermons would resume as if nothing had happened. But for a heartbeat in the void, we had been something more than forgotten. We had been proof that we existed, that we could still bleed, that we could still scream. Hope had bloomed, brief and toxic, like mold in the dark, and like all things in the hive, it had died of starvation.